welcome to When Death Awaits, episode 10. Today, we are in an incredible podcasting studio. We're official, you guys.
We're official.
We're here in Burbank at the Seven Equis studio. There's some awesome podcasts that are out of here. We feel very lucky to be here, the Tiger Belly Pod and a few other amazing ones. And they've been gracious enough to host us for our season finale episode. A big round of applause for ourselves. Episode 10. It's been an honor to be with you, Uncle Rich, and you sharing your stories. And Chris, we finally got a good camera, so a lot of pressure, no pressure, and of course, as always, Diego behind the scenes, handling everything behind the camera. So very grateful for Diego, who's probably the actual MVP of this operation.
I'm not to disagree.
Yeah, sorry, Chris. Nice. Well, today we have another very interesting case to go through. It's out of Baldwin Park, California, which is a city located in the central San Gabriel Valley region of Los Angeles County. It's about 18 miles east of downtown Los Angeles. It's just east of Pasadena, for those who are probably familiar with Pasadena, and closer to El Monte and Covina. And then as of the 2020 census, it's got about a 72,000 population. 75% of the population is Hispanic or Latino, with the rest being a mix of white and Asian. So, that's where we are today. We're talking about an individual named Roy Perez, who lives, of course, in Baldwin Park with his mother and father, and along with his own sister and his sister's 10-year-old daughter. Roy is 28 years old. He is a trained security guard. He's also a student at a Citrus College, so he's perhaps pursuing higher education, perhaps advancement in his life. And he lives, him and his family live next to another family. The parents in the family are Carlos and, I have it here, Dalmi. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. They also have a 14-year-old son, Carlos Jr., a daughter, I think it's Sonia, 9 years old, and then a 3-year-old daughter named Brianna. They're your typical family. Carlos, in particular, he's a successful entrepreneur. He owns a car wash around the corner. He's doing well. The families seem to have a normal neighbor relationship. They live adjacent to each other. Although, Roy has been known to be a little bit of an interesting character over the years. They've actually, he's displayed some erratic behavior at times, enough that actually police have responded to incidents at the house. But I don't think he's ever been arrested or charged. Carlos, knowing that Roy is somewhat of an erratic, unpredictable person, perhaps suffering with some mental health issues or illnesses, decides, I should keep close to this guy. He shares beers with him on occasion, and it's more out of, hey, let me, I don't know if it's so much an enemy, but it's the same concept of keeping your friends close, but your enemies closer. Don't know how this guy might act or react. Carlos is almost acting as father, upright citizen. However, on February 26th, 2008, around 7:30 p.m., something interesting happens, and you get a call, Uncle Rich, but maybe you can talk us through. But what happens before the call?
Well, we have to focus, absolutely, what you just laid as the foundation in terms of what led up ultimately, to this situation. And I think what's most concerning about this is the fact that Carlos is trying to keep Roy at bay by way of talking to him periodically. This went on for a while. And keep in mind, Carlos is a family man. He has 3 children, as you mentioned, but he also wants to build his home there. His house is under construction. And that in and of itself plays large into ultimately what we're talking about here. And as we go into episode 10, I think what's the most tragic part about this is that this is probably one of the most impactful investigations that I've had, primarily because of the fact that how it culminated into this tragedy that could have been avoided altogether. But again, we could discuss that as we go on here. So basically, I get a call to respond to this location, and as I get there, as always, the news media is monitoring these radio calls, and there is a number of news media trucks there. Literally, it was almost difficult for me to even get into the crime scene. One of my good friends by the name of Tony Valdez, who worked for Fox News, Channel 11, he was there as well. And I wish at this point, and I mentioned this, is that I wish I had taken him into the scene, because he would have given us a news reporter's perspective on the whole experience. And I think, unlike me, I'm looking at this from an investigative side versus Tony Valdez looking at it from a more of a universal type of accepted experience. And I think they're more articulate, and they have more of a grasp, I guess, a poetic grasp on the English language. And that's my estimation in terms of these issues. Nonetheless,
You speak very well, Uncle Rich. You do sell yourself short.
And I appreciate the compliment, Omar, but you know what the thing is? That when it comes right down to it, I have to stay very factual. You know, we go back to Joe Friday, just the facts, unfortunately. So I'm not going to have these oratorical flourishes that are going to, in fact, ignite somebody's interest. The fact is, when I obviously ultimately end up in court, nobody cares about anything other than the facts. And that's what we go with. But that aside, so we get there, and lo and behold, I'm told what it transpired by way of these Baldwin Park patrol officers, these first responders, if you will. And they're dealing with the tragedy as well. So it's not just me, but I have to deal with the aftermath. That being that what's going to happen with this individual that committed this crime. So let's go into it. I get there, and I learn that Roy apparently had a mental lapse, a psychotic episode where, in fact, he was out of control. And at one point, the sister started seeing this, so she leaves with her 10-year-old daughter out the front gate. And as she does, she realizes that she just avoided her being a victim in this case. But the mother, who sees her son acting erratically, wants to try and remedy this by approaching this in a way that says, hey, don't be an idiot, and possibly tries to slap him down. And that doesn't work because
and the father, Roy's father, is not home at this time, right?
No, he's not. And I'm not sure if he could conceivably have been a victim himself had he been there. I think anybody in that house at that point could have conceivably been a victim. But he goes into this psychotic rage. The mother then tries to quell that situation by pushing him back, and he decides he's going to push her back, and she ends up being wedged in a piece of furniture where he, in fact, shoots her a number of times. And, the photos themselves just basically depict what exactly transpired that day by way of her arms are up. And that is, in fact, a defense mechanism that people try to do, believing that the bullets are going to be prevented from going into your body if you put your arms up. And that could be further from the truth, but that's just a defense mechanism that we as humans make a practice of. So
and as part of your investigative process, you're looking for these context clues, right? As you're seeing her corpse perhaps on the floor, she's in a defense position, you can assume that she didn't have a weapon around her, but she's clearly prepared for what he's about to do to her.
Absolutely. And there's even some bullets that actually go through furniture as she is wedged in that piece of furniture and the wall, and she's lying down in that particular position, and she's actually in a supine position, so her face is up. So it's evident that she's looking at him as he's shooting her.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably have some accompanying photos, but due to standards and practices and right, keeping things somewhat good for your stomach, probably have some of that blurred out on screen here.
We do have a few. Can we see it for us
Sure.
right here?
We're looking at, in particular, this photo here reflecting her an effort to try and deflect those bullets. And what is I find particularly interesting, if you look at our ballistics people came over and they were trying to do a trajectory, and so that little pink stick right there is reflective of the other rounds that were coming inside. So he didn't just shoot her while she was on the ground, but he continued to fire his weapon.
Oh my God.
And so in that regards, and I'll just give you another example, a closer example of what we're talking about. And then of course, you could see the wounds going through her hand and then ultimately hitting her head and her face. So, I mean, it's a really sad commentary, her and everything. But the worst part about this, guys, is it gets worse.
Oh no.
You know, it gets worse. And again, we go back to Roy and Carlos's conversations. Carlos, who happened to be outside talking to a neighbor, he was a quite neighborly guy. He's across the street. He hears these gunshots. And as he hears these gunshots, he looks over and he sees Roy coming out of the house with a gun in his hand. At this point, he's thinking maybe he's the target. Carlos thinking maybe he's the target. Instead, Roy goes out his gate and goes next door and into Carlos's home yard, the side yard, where the windows are under construction. So the windows are not closed. So he then looks straight at, this is Carlos telling me this story. He looks straight at Carlos as in like a blank stare.
Gosh.
And starts to climb into the window.
Now Carlos trying to get his attention is like, I think if I'm in this situation, I mean, he's got a gun. That's terrifying.
Right.
But is he trying to like, hey, what's going on? Let's talk. That's what I think I would think if I were in that scenario, what I would do. Did Carlos do anything to stop Roy from continuing, this rampage?
He made an effort to try and bring that attention to him by way of wave, hey, I'm here, come here, kind of thing. And despite that, Roy is now climbing into this open window where, interestingly enough, Carlos's 3 kids and wife are in the home.
And
in the
how big of a guy is Roy? Like, he's walking through an open windowsill.
He's probably, and I met him personally, and we could talk about the interview in a few minutes, but he's probably about 5'8", probably weighs about 210. He's a big guy.
Okay, yeah, I mean, he's a security guard,
right.
So I'd imagine, he had some physical presence.
Right, he did. And so as he climbs into the window, at this point, Carlos realizes that he's not preventing him from going in. So he begins to yell into the house to tell his family, go into the bedroom and lock the door.
So he's yelling from outside.
Right.
Yeah.
And they apparently heard him, because now the wife, she gets all the kids and she puts them into the bedroom, locks the door. And at this point, Roy starts to walk down the hallway. And like you just said, he's a big guy. He's a security guard. And he kicks the door in.
Oh my God.
And that's where we can see that this is the window that he climbed in through. And he now goes in, and this is what he does. And again, you're looking at these photos. Here, the mother is trying to protect her kids, and she's also in a defensive position as well. But despite that, the fact is that he managed to kill the wife, the baby, the 3-year-old, and shot the 9-year-old, and he shot the 15-year-old, Carlos Jr., I think like 4 times in the back.
Jeez.
And here's the thing, and I just want to mention it because Roy was, in fact, a trained security guard. And one of the things that I learned from this particular experience is that they train them because when they're dealing with, ironically, individuals that are amped up on phencyclidine or methamphetamine, and they're in a combative situation, um, they train them to shoot 2 in the body and 2 in the head. And we did that in law enforcement as well. That was one of the common practices. But for them to start training security guards in that method became somewhat of how he applied those principles in this case.
So are those reflective in what he did to his mother and then the family?
100%. 100%. The training kicked in. And I've seen other security guards that have been involved in shootings, and they're pretty much the same thing. In terms of how they apply those principles, they utilize that training that they've garnered from those shooting practice by way of doing this, and this is what ultimately happened.
Yeah. With that all being said, can we talk a little bit about the gun that he used? I think there's probably a little bit there in that. Is this a gun he used from work? Is it his own personal gun? Is he licensed to carry? And I'd imagine, any gunshot makes a loud noise, probably why Carlos came outside. But as far as you got to be a very good marksman to kind of just, he's shooting at close range. But I imagine I'm trying to put myself in the situation, and I'll have the same question for Chris, and we'll do that in a second. But I would love to know the facts of what he was using and how it probably played a part in all this.
He definitely wasn't using a security guard gun. Usually they issue either a 45 or 9mm, and usually like a Beretta or the 45. There's a number of brands, but in this case, what we have is a 380 caliber semi-automatic Astra, which is one of the cheaper brands of guns. To the extent when we did recover that weapon, it was in fact completely empty and probably has an excess of about, I think, in excess of 12 rounds. And don't quote me on that, but I think he even went so far as to reload, because after he shot his mother, and then he went over and then he applied an additional maybe 10, 11 shots to kill the family. Jeez. So no doubt about it. That being said, with regards to that gun, yeah, it wasn't a very good gun. But keep in mind that he's in close quarter situations. This gun is not very accurate. And for anybody that shoots a gun knows that, generally speaking, from afar, if you're not looking down the barrel of that gun using your sights, you're probably going to be inaccurate. But when you're in close quarter situations, accuracy is not even an issue, because in particular in this bedroom, you're looking at this thing as maybe they're within 2 to 3 feet of him, and it's easy to just aim and shoot, and that's the reason why he was able to manage to shoot everybody. Interestingly enough, the 9-year-old, she actually survived, and so did the son, but she actually only ended up with a graze wound. So I had an opportunity to talk to her after this whole thing. And the most horrific part about this is not so much that I talked to her, as much as the fact that she experienced some guy pointing a weapon at her. And now she has to live with not only that experience for the rest of her life, but the fact that she witnessed her mother, her brother, and her little sister get shot in front of her. I mean, think about that just for a minute. I mean, geez, I don't know about you guys. And then I'm there, I'm looking at this thing, and the worst part of what the most stomach churning experience for me is having to talk to this little girl. That to me is like, oh my God. I mean, so
how do you approach that? Like, what's you're dealing, every kid's got a different personality. There's got to be some protocols with probably how you're talking to kids and investigating or interrogating children. Can you speak a little bit to your approach when it comes to pediatric
good? And I appreciate the question, because generally, a big guy like me with a suit and tie walking out, okay, tell me what happened. I mean, come on, really? So what I generally would do is I would just get into preliminary understanding of what happened. I wasn't going to delve too deeply into it. She's now at an aunt's house. I think she was over in Montclair or something when I went and talked to her that following evening or that following morning. But so generally, I wanted to get an in-depth understanding of what happened. So I use this pediatric psychologist from USC who actually taught at the law school there, and I would bring him in, and I would take him over to our special victims unit, and by way of a two-way mirror, he would go into a room, and there would be toys and the like, and it was a quiet setting, and at that point he would talk to her in a more sensitive way and in a more conducive environment that would possibly solicit, what we needed from that. Because you have to remember that information will in fact be used later on during the course of the trial. But keep in mind that in this case, it's interesting having done that. And of course, I know we're moving really forward and I don't necessarily want to go off on a tangent, but what I did find was she went straight into it. He didn't even solicit any kind of foundation. She just this was all on my mind. And like you said, kids are different. He just went straight into the whole experience. And I was like, wow, evidently this is just something that she is just continually mulling over. I'm just speculating at that point.
And did you get an opportunity to talk to Carlos Jr.? He's the 14-year-old, and I think you mentioned, and maybe she had shared that he was trying to escape, right? And that's why his shots are in the back.
Correct. He was actually moving toward the front window, but he never got there. And no, I never got an opportunity to talk to him. Primarily because he was still in intensive care. And that's another thing, and if you want to talk about that, the issues of having to talk to somebody who's under sedation, generally the courts don't look very favorably on that, because when you're sedated or you're under pain medication, are you going to get a truthful statement from them? Yeah. So we generally try to shy away from that, only because okay, you got a statement, but were they of sound mind at the time?
I mean, speaking of sound mind, too, the questions kind of come up even regarding Roy, right, and his potential defenses that are available to him. But before we jump into there, I want to, play a little, not role play, but I want to ask Chris, and I want to ask you, well, let me ask Chris first, and then I want to ask you. But if you were in this situation, you are in the house, I'm kind of asking you to play maybe a kid here, but let's say you're in your adult form, as you are today, I hope. And
almost.
Yeah. And you have a guy coming in. It's nighttime. You come in, you have your family with you. What are you going to do? Let's say the same fact pattern. How are you going to react to the situation? And then I'm going to ask you, Uncle Rich, what maybe Chris should do, or how Chris is...
Some tips for survival.
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up watching too many action movies, so my first response would be any sort of retaliation or trap or blockade as possible. Now, I know that's also something if you do have an intruder coming in and, maybe you have directions to hop out of the house, but if you're maybe enclosed into a room, I would block that with a chair, a couch. I would have weapons out, right when he pops in, ready to attack. If there were a window, perhaps I would try to jump out of it and, leave the premises. But
do we know if it was on the first floor or second floor?
First floor.
First floor.
So
okay.
Single story.
I would have for sure probably hopped out and gotten the heck out of there.
All right, let's see how Chris did. What Uncle Rich, what would you recommend?
I would say that's about a 20% survival rate.
Oh, no. What are the tips for survival?
Well,
that might be a perfect time for our liquid death moment of the day, right? I'm just gonna have
to pass it around. Yeah.
It's interesting. Every situation, every scenario is going to dictate a different type of outcome. You're talking to a guy who's got 32 years of experience and has been dealt with so many type of experiences, in particular with force and the like. That being said, and the recommendation on that end is easily, again, I'm not going to second guess, Carlos's approach, but if he had thrown something at him or distracted him to the extent where he would have actually come toward him, that would be the objective. As he's climbing over, run toward him. You have to react fast. There's no time to think when it comes to these kind of scenarios. None. You either react or you die. And that's the thing about this. So reaction time is very crucial. And I've been shot at a few times, so I kind of have to deal with those issues in terms of what we do. I mean, just as an example, I mentioned this, you know, I mean, if you're in a police car and you get shot, you start getting shot, what do you want to do? You don't want to stay in that car. You want to abandon ship as quickly as you can, just like in this house. You want to abandon ship as quickly as you can. Run out that front door. Don't lock yourself in a room, because now you're entrapped, you're enclosed, and suddenly if this guy decides, and these are bedroom doors, this isn't a bank vault, you know, for Christ's sake. So ultimately it's going to end up tragically. So I would recommend that you act and you react quickly, without even thinking about what's your first instinct for survival. That's been my approach, and for those that I've known that have survived these kind of experiences, a perfect example. We'll go to this one. What did the sister do? She ran out the door. She was smart. I mean, I'm not suggesting, you know, moms wasn't smart by trying to quell him by, you know, grabbing his arms and like that was, but that was her son, you know, I mean. So we have to look at it in the big picture, and that's my take on that.
I mean, a part of it too, maybe like I would try to put myself in this scenario, and you know, we can probably train our own instincts in instances. Of course, there's a natural reaction. One was to run, the other was to lock yourself in the room. Perhaps too. I mean, I can't imagine everyone's aim is as good as John Wick, and even John Wick, he's wasting a lot of bullets, right? I mean, it's all a movie, right? But perhaps like throwing things, creating chaos for people can, you know, throw their aim off even just a little bit. And, you know, whether it's throwing clothes at them or bathroom toiletries, whatever's around you. You know, Chris said, you know, grab a weapon. You may not have a weapon in your room. I'm trying to think what I have in my room right now. Maybe a little lamp I would toss, but then after that, it's like I'm holding the comforter up. Yeah, exactly. So, you know, I mean, that part of this, like for the listener to think about what it is they do, what they have in their room, how they might react to this. So we appreciate, you know, how you've seen it happen and play out in the past and what you'd recommend.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting because once the person that's committing this crime knows where you are, then it becomes even more problematic. Whereas if you're hiding under a bed and they're looking around for you, that's one story. But he knew that everybody was in that bedroom. So I'll kick it in, and now I'm going to find my 4 victims, and I'm going to terrorize them. Going back full circle on this thing and talking to Carlos, the father, and I remember him distinctly telling me, he says that Roy was envious of the fact that he had a family, he had a home, he had a business, and Roy became envious of it.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what's the motive here, right? He did this. I don't know what the fight was regarding with his mother. Do you have any detail on that? And then, like, you know, obviously he came outside. He was a man possessed. He didn't go after Carlos, but Carlos yelled for his family, and he went into the house. So clearly that kind of lines up. Envy could be something, but I wanted to ask if there was anything else you had uncovered.
That would be one of the strongest motives, but keep in mind, if I may indulge you, I did in fact shortly after, and it's funny, I'm looking at this video that we have we had a brief news video. They're actually showing him being taken into custody, but it's very brief. And
should we play the clip?
Sure. Okay. It's only 45 seconds. I'll play it real quick like.
Police fled a neighborhood east of Los Angeles after a gunman opens fire, hitting 5 people. 2 women and a 4-year-old girl were killed.
That's him being
2
taken
of the
into
children
custody.
were wounded. The shooting happened in a suburb called Baldwin Park, about 18 miles outside of L.A. Someone called 911 about 7:30 local time to report gunfire. When police got there, they found a Hispanic man standing in the street armed with a handgun. He was placed under arrest. Investigators say he had apparently gotten into an argument with his mother and shot her to death before heading to a neighbor's home where the other shootings occurred. The wounded children are 14 and 9 years old. Both were taken to a hospital in critical condition. Judy Boysha, The Associated Press.
Wow. You think about that just for a minute, and obviously it's a very superficial story. But now let's go into those experiences and, you know, examining, you know, Roy's room where he has paperwork reflecting his affiliation with the local street gang. Relevant? I'm not sure. I mean, you guys could surmise either way. I mean, but anyways,
Would something like that be admissible and relevant in court?
it depends on what motivated him to do it. For instance, if it was a gang-related case, no doubt that we would utilize that as evidence to reflect his affiliation, and that would be a motivation for him doing this. Again,
I'm assuming there were no ties with the family and the gang.
no.
Yeah.
This was a well-established family, and it's interesting. As I went through the house, I'm talking about Roy's house, I noticed there was a family portraits about the family, and yet not one single photo had Roy in it.
Interesting.
Again, and he was living in the back room, so a little on the chaotic side in terms of his room. But I just thinking to myself, I just found that particularly interesting. But anyways, going after all was said and done, I ended up talking to old Roy, which you could see here. He's sort of in a haze, if you will, and I got to talking with him.
And sorry to cut you off there, but I think I don't want to miss the point. Like when they put Roy into custody, was he trying to flee the scene, or was he like hiding somewhere, or like how did you guys get him? Anyway, we saw the video clip, and the video clip said that he was outside holding the gun.
That was it. The 911 showed up. He made no effort to run, made no effort to escape. He just resigned himself to that reality. And so once he was in custody, now I have the dubious honor of having to go talk to him. Now, mind you, you guys seen what he's done. The fact is, we have the death of children, in this case, death of a child and attempt to kill a number of other people. And yet, I have to go in there with this relatively impartial, objective approach as though nothing has happened. And that in and of itself is very internalizing, because you're angry, you're frustrated, but you cannot jeopardize the case by using force. I had years ago, and I don't want to go off on a tangent, but we had a child molester that was over at the Hall of Justice when they was open, and the sergeant started slapping this guy around. I mean, really?
Oh my God!
You can't
Straight
do
out
that.
of the movies, yeah.
Right? You can't do that, and you have to have that perspective, and I've learned that over the years. And that being said, so I walk in there and I go, "Hey, how's it going, Roy? You go okay? You want a cup of coffee?" Hey, think about that. What am I doing? I'm compromising myself, but I have, that's the objective. And at that point, he's just, as you could see, this photo kind of reflects what he was and how he was. And he was basically refusing to talk in any way, shape, or form. He was non-responsive. And yet he managed to do all of these things with a very calculating approach. Think about that just for a minute. He won't talk to me, but yet he could go about doing these things with just unmitigating callous.
What was I'm assuming, like, was there a drug test done, alcohol test, like, were any of I'm assuming some of that is probably standard in the scenario. Can you walk through like what the protocol is there?
Well, you cannot use intoxication as a defense.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no drug test or alcohol test. It's just not in the cards. The fact is that he committed this crime regardless of what his intoxicated state was or lack thereof.
Yeah.
So in that regards, the whole process then begins, and that, of course, is the judicial process. But in the midst of all of this, ends up over at Men's Central Jail with 2 attempted murders and 3 murder charges. So I decide, because I didn't get a statement from him, to monitor his visits. And his father came to visit him, who was not at home at the time. And they get into a conversation. And they're speaking Spanish to each other. And they both start crying. So I'm like, really? you're going to have some level of remorse now. And I think he was more remorseful of the fact that he killed his mom than he had killed the family next door. That was my interpretation of that particular conversation. I just thought that was the case. And you know, but I don't, you know, I'm just trying to bring things into a tight-knit story, if you will. I know kind of going back and forth, but I wanted to keep things.
But that's kind of a testament to the complexity. It seems like a simple, like, guy goes in a rampage, kills a bunch of people, but they're peel the layers of the onion back. There's so many things to talk about, and there's so many things that are even just relevant to today. This is 2008, right? I mean, so, you know, I appreciate you trying to keep it tight, but also, I appreciate the nuance.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that because you know, you look at that, the video of the news clip, you know, that was it.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody's going to change the channel. Oh my God, look what happened in Baldwin Park, and
Right.
that's it. We're not going to think about it again.
Right.
But let's deep dive into this whole experience, and now you see what we're talking about, not only in the context of the impact that it's had on the families, but the impact that it's had on so many other people that would live within that area, and so forth and so on. And to the extent, and this case got lost in terms of media attention, because shortly thereafter he ended up taking a plea agreement. We didn't even go to trial. So there was no testimony.
So he pled guilty.
And he received 3 life sentences and they're each is 25 to life. So ultimately he got 75 years, and then pretty much.
Yeah, I was wondering that. I was looking it up when we were discussing it earlier. It's like a basic life conviction in the U.S. carries a minimum of 25 years before there's parole eligibility.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always wondered earlier when I before law school, when I was a kid, 3 life sentences, like, what is this, some sort of reincarnation? Like, how does this apply? But what it means, like you said, is 3 life sentences gets him effectively 75 years. That's probably truly a life sentence.
Agreed. And there's legislation right now pending that apparently if anybody has been convicted before 1990 could literally get out if you have a life sentence.
Wow.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of.
Oh, well.
Fortunately, that doesn't apply in this case, but.
Yeah, but from a legal perspective, really quickly, again, I don't want to go too much into it, but as I'm, you know, they're like, you have to remove yourself as the objective investigator here. There's also everyone's right to assistance of counsel, and there are public defenders, there are defense attorneys, and they need to advocate on behalf of their client, even if all the facts are against them, right?
Agreed.
And I'm putting my public defender hat on here. What I would probably the only way out of this is to argue a mental capacity sort of self-defense, in that, you know, he's previously displayed erratic behavior that has required intervention of law enforcement before. I don't know, had he ever had any sort of diagnosis for a mental health condition? Was that even, the defense clearly, he was advised to just plead guilty. Maybe he didn't have enough of one, but was there anything in your investigation or follow-up, or just because he had just pled guilty, that was it kind of just done there?
Yeah, 2 things on that end. One is that the burden, obviously, to find this person guilty is by way of the people, by way of the prosecutors. The burden to prove that he's mentally ill is on the part of the defense. So they've got to bring in all these psychiatrists and things of that nature. And one of the things I say to you, when I heard this from a district attorney many years ago, because I've handled a number of other of these cases, and they try that, you know, that issue of, you know, my client was, you know, psychologically challenged at the time that he did this. And this particular district attorney said, well, if he was that psychologically distorted, why didn't he just attack the tree and think that was the person, you know? So in this case, he killed his mother and then targeted that family by climbing that window. So there's no doubt about it that whatever motivated him to do that was not going to be impaired by way of his psychological, shortcomings. And in that regards, I have to say, I buy into that, because in many of cases I've had, you know, other psychiatric cases wherein, they try to challenge that, and it doesn't work.
Yeah,
It's
and
really
and
it's a hard threshold to cross.
absolutely, and we don't need to get into it because it's super nuanced, but there's some news this week that California, who's probably has the most aggressive gun control laws in the state, is trying to address gun ownership from folks who are diagnosed with mental health. And that is like almost, this is just very relevant for this today because that happened this week. It'll be interesting to see if it still has to go through to the Supreme Court and pass all of the legislative review. But, it's something that we haven't figured out yet really as a society. When it comes, I know gun control is a hot button issue, and we can definitely talk a million hours about it on another pod, but thought it was something interesting to bring up just in the context of this case.
And I would just say that's a very good point, because if you look at it from this guy, Roy, I mean, if he was not convicted of any crime, and despite his mental conditions, he could have easily have walked into a gun store and bought a gun. And because the unpredictable nature of the human element is so important in terms of law enforcement and in terms of just dealing with situations of this nature. Think about it.
Yeah.
One day you're alive and well, hanging out with your kids and your wife. The next moment, somebody's climbing into your window, I mean,
it's just a luck of the draw of who you decide to live next to, right? And you don't really know your neighbors completely. And I think it's a good thing to be friendly with your neighbors. I think there's only good to come out of it. But even with that, in this instance, it could have some drastic consequences.
Agreed. I'm not going to deny that. Absolutely.
And I was going to mention as well, so over time, Carlos did try to make a relationship with his neighbor, right? And I know there was a couple ways of how we could approach that. Can you kind of dive in a little bit into that as far as, being friendly to your neighbor, kind of recognizing signs of someone that might be a little bit more hostile, and how to approach something like that in the future?
I like that question, Chris, because, I mean, it was a strategic decision on his part to either befriend him, which is what he did, and kept a cautionary friendship, if you will, by way of periodically having a beer with him, knowing that he could keep him at bay that way. Or the second approach would be, hey, I'm not going to befriend you. I am going to keep you at a distance in hopes that you will never want to talk to me. And even go so far as to give him the evil eye. I mean, so strategically, to me, I mean, that's why
it's so hard.
Yeah.
Right. You have to decide. But to me, you can't pick your neighbors, number one. Number two, the fact is that Carlos decided that he was going to take that approach, and it's evident that that didn't work. So
I mean, yeah, like you said, sorry to bring it back up, but he built a relationship with him, and the only motive we know of, and that probably is the most likely one, was that he was jealous of what this guy had, right? And he, in an effort where he's like, hey, this is my family, these are the kids, this is what the kids are probably up to, an average human, I would like to think, or a reasonable human, that endears you to somebody, that develops the relationship. Here, it was a source of envy. And, ultimately when he got into this passion state, it was another motive for him to continue.
Outstanding analysis. I would just say that's exactly right. It worked the complete opposite. And now all of a sudden, you want to talk about your kids? Oh, well, guess what? I'm going to take that away from you. I'm speculating at this point, but think about what ultimately came of it.
It's chilling, and it also it makes you debilitated on how you should treat people, right? Like, you want to treat people the way you want to be treated, but maybe that person doesn't want to be treated the way you want to be treated.
Agreed.
Yeah.
You have to look at the bigger picture. If there is other parties, whether it's a suicide or a mass shooting, even in this case with Roy, yes, we know he did it, but is there other parties involved? Is who provided him with the gun? What was there other motives conceivably you have to look at? So you cannot just hone in on one particular perspective. You have to look at it from interestingly enough, the defense attorney's perspective, because as a homicide investigator, as we finish up episode 10, we have to always look at not just your prosecution side, but we have to also look at being objective, being impartial, and more than anything else is you're not looking at this from the standpoint of a conviction. That's not what we do. That's not our job. Our job is to investigate, get the facts, and then provide those to the district attorney. And by the way, I was admonished one time at an installation for a judge. I was told, would you talk on my behalf as I get installed as a judge? I said, no problem. And I talked about how this judge and I had convicted a particular individual. And then the judge that was presiding over these proceedings said, your job is not to convict. Your job is just to provide the facts and let the jury. And I'm thinking this is a very jovial moment.
Oh my God, this is completely unrelated, but it reminds me. Once upon a time, I was a sports journalist, and I covered my college baseball team, and I was in the press box covering, and I think one of our players, the team was losing, like our school, UC Irvine, was where Chris and I went. They were losing, and then some player came up and hit this massive home run, and I hands up and I'm cheering. I'm so excited. I have my buddy Tyler with me, and we high five, and there's an old reporter for the local newspaper. He turns to us, and we'd been very friendly with him before, and he's just like, you're not supposed to do that shit in here. And it was you got to, as a news reporter, keep impartial too.
Exactly.
Even though we were just young college students thinking we could root for our team, but there was a seasoned guy who's like, this isn't your job. You're not supposed to be cheering in here. You got to just report. So that just reminded me of that.
I would love to cheer in front of him if a jury ever got a guy convicted. I'd be like, yeah, man. You know, but unfortunately, I got to maintain a level. Yeah, okay. Well.
Yeah. Well, all right, good. The facts. Yeah,
exactly.
Nice.
Well, I think it's time where we hop into our When Death Awaits Q&A segment, where we source audience's questions from around social media. So the first I'd like to start off is from Andre from Huntington Beach. And this question is, do you see a common theme of what drives people to commit homicide? Is it gangs, belonging, love, jealousy, like in this particular case, revenge, or is it random?
Well, here in LA County, 70% of all of our homicides are, in fact, gang-related. And in many cases...
You said 70%.
70%. So, interestingly enough, some of them is based on envy and jealousy by way of a female, prompting them to get involved in these things. And because they have a propensity to be violent anyways, might as well just go ahead and move forward with it. But that's a very broad question. A lot of times people commit violent acts spontaneously, especially if they have a weapon available to them. But to me, anybody that has any kind of proclivity to commit violence are generally going to commit violence. And unfortunately for our society, in particular here in LA County, which is what I was concerned with during my tenure, is that there is a lot of folks that are not inclined to commit violent acts. But those that do, domestic violence is generally a good percentage. So you're not going to get the Night Stalker cases. Those are very rare. And then, of course, your gang-related cases. But I would say domestic violence and gang-related cases are probably two of the more fundamental concerns that we should have in our society.
I got a question for you, and this is more of a me as a fan asking, is earlier today, I think around 9:45 a.m. Pacific time, the Associated Press tweeted out that the Las Vegas police department, or maybe the sheriff's department, I can't remember exactly which, they actually arrested a suspect in the Tupac Shakur shooting.
Well, it's funny. It's actually what they did. What they did was they combined their police department and their sheriff's department to save money.
In Vegas.
Right.
Okay.
Secondly, back in 2005 or 6, I took part in search warrants being executed for the Tupac shooting because we were doing that over in the Compton area because he had some affiliation with the Bloods, and in Compton there's predominantly blood gangs, So that being said, I'm somewhat familiar with the case, but more than that, the fact that they have somebody years later, they must have received some information by way of maybe somebody coming forward. But that's going to be really hard pressed.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like this. It's such a high profile case. It's so long from now. You also have obviously his ties to Los Angeles and how high profile was. I was curious if you had any involvement. So very cool to hear that you were out in executing some of the search warrants.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and also, of course, Biggie Smalls, I had some level of involvement in that in terms of some of the folks that I kind of had the unfortunate pleasure of putting away, but that's another story for another day.
Oh my
And
God.
make that episode 12.
Yeah. All right.
Season 2. Let's hop into another question. We have Nora from New York City. Uncle Rich, for you, how do you deal with the emotional toll of investigating and discussing such dark and tragic cases on the show?
Wow. That's a good question. And I appreciate the question. And this goes to whether it be first responders or guys like me that have to continue dealing with this. I think to a large extent, for me at least, it's evident from these past 10 episodes, that I find humor as a means by which to sort of vent my psychological frustration with how people treat each other. More than that is, and I think this is one of the things you have to understand, is that when you're dealing with these kind of situations, in particular with a homicide investigator, you're not only dealing with the initial contact and the efforts to try and find the person that did this, but you're also dealing with the court proceedings. And that becomes even more challenging because now everything you've done, and then I'm going to answer the question, everything you've done by way of the investigation is now being challenged in a court of law by the judge, by your prosecutor, by your defense attorney. And I used to walk in a court and I would see a jury, sometimes 2 juries, if I had 2 defendants, and I would see the defendant, the prosecutor, everybody in there, the court reporter, and I would look inside this room and I would say, wow, I created this experience by my investigation. So how do I deal with it? I just say that that the issue of humor and exercise and try and do other things outside of just not being so involved and engrossed in this type. I move forward and I don't take anything personal. So
here's one last question that we have from Scott in Palm Springs. What personal takeaways or insights have each of us gained from our experiences, discussions on the show?
Wow. I like that question. You guys should need to answer that question because I think correct me if I'm wrong, maybe I've enlightened you on some of the world that I've been involved in.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I can kind of just take a step back and say I'm not particularly, I don't want to say fan, but like my interests lie in like very dude stuff, sports, music, TV, film. Rarely have I been that engaged in true crime. My wife is a huge true crime fan. When we go on long road trips, our rule is we do one like sports or pop culture podcast, and then she'll put on like a Crime Junkies or Deadline type podcast that who are crushing it in this space. And the unsolved murders is something to me that I don't know. She loves an ending. She loves knowing the ending for any shows or movies. 5 minutes into the movie, I'm like, how do you listen to unsolved murders? But I found that the homicide ones, and there's just so many interesting cases throughout the U.S., are interesting to me, and having the legal background as well. It's been super enlightening for me to hear your perspective and how you're investigating. And in my head, it's kind of putting me back in a good way, PTSD from my criminology class and my crime law class, and in seeing how the law enforcement interacts with the legal side of things. And that's why I always try to kind of ask you, like, because you're not adjudicating the case, but your work is so integral for finding justice. So it's very enlightening, interesting for me to see that interaction. A lot of us are only exposed to murder and homicide, fortunately, through media, film, TV. Where many of us are lucky not to have experienced murder or death in our lives. Knock on wood, right? But so for me, this whole experience has been really fun and awesome. There's been a lot of content from a fan's perspective or from a news perspective. Rarely is there been a podcast that's from an investigator's perspective. So that's why I think is amazing about When Death Awaits. It's what I look forward to every time we get together. And just being a part of it, I really enjoy that.
Nice. I think that was a brilliant answer. Just to build off of
Thank
that,
you, Chris.
you're welcome. I think, Umar definitely hit it on the head to be able to, you were one of the first on the crime scenes. I mean, you're walking through a house, you're going through a building, you're turning corners, and you're seeing these atrocities, right? And I think this is something that not every human is able or has the stomach to see, but for someone to be able to see that every day, and most likely I'm sure you would be getting calls every day, if not every couple days, of a new case, a new murder, a new homicide. And I think we just have to thank you for your service. And I know that you mentioned of how you even get through a lot of these emotional sites and things, and it's just to keep on going forward. So I think a big takeaway is to have that positive mindset and to continue to move forward. And I think, whatever happens in this world and the things that you've seen, I mean, we have to keep moving forward. But I've had a pleasure to be able to work with this amazing team here, season 1, and we're just getting started. I know there's a lot of amazing cases that you've talked about and that you're yet to kind of reveal to the audience here. But we're really
another
looking
thing
forward.
I'll add on to Chris there too, and it's a little homage to this little guy you have on the table. And I'll let you speak to like the significance of him. But, coming from a legal background, you are taught to be very tenacious with the facts and don't leave any stone uncovered because you're dealing with the law, you're dealing with people's lives, and there's so much value in being thorough. A lot of people aren't cut out to do that extra work. And your mentality that you've explained to us and you've shared with us off camera too is, you got to have a little bit of a bulldog mentality, right? And I know there's probably some controversy on associating the bulldog with the sheriff's department. I'd love for you to share that with our audience.
Well, I am proud to say, by way of the Los Angeles Times back in the early 70s, they actually considered us bulldogs because when we picked up a case, we never let go. And that was something which we proudly display over at our office. Wow. And with that said, I know that the Sheriff's Department is going away from emblems and animals and things of that nature, but I have to say that the guys over at the office still pursue this type of approach, and that is to not let a case go when they pick it up. And I would just say along the lines of going to the question, and that is what we have here for the last 10 episodes are cases that have been solved, okay? And I've solved them by way of my tenacious attitude, as Umar just mentioned. I didn't have to. We could have moved forward without ever having to do an investigation, because that's the kind of discretion that I had. But I wasn't going to let go. That's why I took this job on, and that's why I'm going to continue. I cannot say that for a certain percentage of people that come into investigations, I'm afraid to say. So when families get frustrated when they do not get justice, there may be some element that on the part of the investigator that may not necessarily want to pursue that somebody.
Yeah, I mean, you're like you said, 70% of the murders are gang related, right? It's got to be scary for you if these are the people you're putting behind bars and you're associated with it. That might travel home with you, right? And that's got to be a little terrifying in some instances. So we appreciate you being loud and proud of the work that you do And we're really looking forward to season 2 and hearing about what other types of cases. Maybe even though I say I don't like them, unsolved murders, maybe I can make an exception to see if there's anything that is super juicy that are back in your 25-year case log that we can discuss. But I really appreciate you being a great ambassador, and I would think the sheriff's office is probably very appreciative, I would hope, of the work that you've done.
I appreciate it, Omar.
All right.
Ready.
Well, thank you guys for episode 10 of When Death Awaits. Remember, follow us on all socials at When Death Awaits. Check us out on your favorite podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple. We are wherever you want to be. And I think we probably have some exciting stuff for our super fans coming up with perhaps some merch, Chris,
Yes.
maybe?
Yes, we have some merch actually that we're going to be launching soon. So definitely keep your eyes peeled across the social channels and our new website that we're actually in development. So you can check out all of the past episodes there as well, and stories behind and a lot of behind the scenes content.
Yeah, and we want to hear from you. What kind of cases do you want to hear? Are there stuff you want us to react to? Send it in the comments or whendeathawaits@gmail.com. We are going to take these first 10 episodes, take our feedback, see what we can do better, and come back even stronger.
I love it.
Fantastic. Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
you.
guys.